All right, I think we can get started. Good evening, everybody. I'm Anthony Maricola, Manager of Adult Services and Programming at New Canaan Library. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this evening's annual Salant Lecture. The Richard Salant Lecture is named for the late president of CBS News, whose tenure in the 1960s and 70s included the news challenges of the Vietnam War and Watergate. Richard Salant lived in New Canaan for 37 years prior to his death in 1993. The library honors his dedication to integrity in broadcast journalism and the First Amendment. Lectures like this are one of the many ways that New Canaan Library delivers on its mission to inspire lifelong learning through innovation and discovery, to be the information and cultural center of the community. We serve as the platform for lifelong learning in the community through our exceptional and dynamic collections and our broad range of enriching programs that provide experiential learning for all ages. I'd now like to introduce Nancy Geary, our moderator for this evening. Nancy Geary is the Executive Director of the New Canaan Museum Historical Society. Prior to this, Nancy was a prosecutor for the Criminal Bureau of the Massachusetts Attorney General's Office, an author of 4 novels, and a lawyer in private practice in Boston and New York. Welcome, Nancy, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you to the New Canaan Library for inviting me to participate in this special evening. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Brian Lehrer. Brian Lehrer is host of the Brian Lehrer Show, WNYC Radio's daily call-in program covering local and global politics and life. He also hosts Brian Lehrer, a daily politics podcast, which focuses on national politics. In 2007, the Brian Lehrer Show was recognized with the George Foster Peabody Award for radio that builds community rather than divides. In addition to the Peabody, Brian has won numerous awards, including 7 Associated Press New York Broadcasters Best Interview Awards just since 2000, and 2 Best Talk Show Awards from the Garden State Journalists Association. The Brian Lehrer Show has hosted political guests including Barack Obama, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Mitch McConnell, and Boris Johnson, and cultural guests including Spike Lee and Aaron Sorkin. Brian has been a questioner in televised New York City mayoral debates for every election since 1997. Brian Lehrer is also a commentator on local and national issues on television and in print. He's appeared on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, C-SPAN, New York One, and the Colbert Report on Comedy Central. He's written op-ed pieces for publications including the New York Times, the Daily News, Newsday, and Slate. He holds master's degrees in public health from Columbia University and in journalism from The Ohio State University, and a bachelor's in music and mass communications from the State University of New York at Albany. Brian has been called a master interviewer, doggedly on the ball, and the equivalent of LeBron James or Steph Curry in the interviewing game. Most recently, Brian was very surprised to hear himself mentioned on TV during last Friday night's Mets-Yankees game. The Mets announcer, Gary Cohen, was asking someone a follow-up question about a certain play and said, "I was just probing, doing my best Brian Lehrer, getting a little deeper answer." Maybe some of you heard that. I have been a huge fan of Brian's for many years. I admire his ability to make complex information and issues comprehensible, to ask the right questions and then follow up with even better ones, and to treat all of his guests and callers with respect. It is truly a privilege to have him here tonight. Welcome, Brian Lehrer.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. Great to see you here and meet you for the first time through this. And thank you all for attending via Zoom today. And thank you, New Canaan Library, for inviting me to give the Salant Lecture this year, as I did last year. And as I did last year, I'm gonna give you some prepared remarks from notes for the first 10 or 15 minutes. And then Nancy's gonna ask me some questions, and you all can ask me some questions. You'll put them in the chat function of your Zoom when the time comes, if you have them. And I know this happens to fall around sundown as Yom Kippur is ending. So any of you who are breaking your fast around now, I hope you had an easy fast, and feel free to eat while this event is taking place. I guess it's one of the advantages of attending on Zoom rather than at the library in person. You can watch and eat and no one will think you're being rude or noisy or messy. I only wish you could electronically share some bagels and lox with me. Now, as it happens, and I think this is why the library invited me back, our event last year was on Sunday, March 8th. It was the last thing I did before a live audience right through today. And I imagine for some of you, it was the last live crowd you were in. For a little bit of context and to review, because it can seem like such a blur by now, New York had its first confirmed COVID case on March 1st last year. On March 8th, the day I was at the library, there were 105. And on that same day, Governor Cuomo said this at one of the first of his famous daily COVID briefings on TV. He said, quote, "There is more fear, more anxiety than the facts would justify. This is not the Ebola virus. This is not the SARS virus. This is a virus that we have a lot of information on," unquote. Now, it's almost forgotten that there were some public health experts saying very different things, but that's where the governor of New York was while I was speaking at the library on March 8th. The next day, Monday, March 9th, the first case in a Connecticut resident was confirmed. The day after that, Tuesday, March 10th, Governor Lamont declared a public health emergency and limited public gatherings to 250 people. Now, had that happened 2 days earlier, with the capacity of the library, as I think I recall, I think some of you with tickets to my March 8th talk would have been sent home. Then again, I probably wouldn't have come. Now, one behind the scenes story from my appearance that day, usually when I give a talk, I hang around for a few minutes for the people who come up to the stage afterwards, and want to say something or ask me something one-on-one. But for that event, I told the team at the library that I would agree to appear despite the spreading virus, as long as they ushered me right off the stage afterwards with no close contact, and they did. We were all on masks, by the way. Nobody was talking about masks yet on March 8th of last year. So again, a virtual hello. The Salant Lecture is officially a media lecture. So let me talk a little bit about COVID and the media. When I was here last year talking about the 30-year history of my show, I said one of the biggest changes over the years was that I have had to spend more time than in the past just fact-checking lies, or as Kellyanne Conway called them, alternative facts, when I would rather have been hosting debates on different approaches to solving the problems we all could agree existed. Unfortunately, the partisan response to COVID has made the necessity of busting misinformation even more central to the media's job today than when I talked about it a year and a half ago. For example, by March 25th last year, back to the timeline, Cuomo was no longer downplaying the virus, but that was the day that President Trump said he thought the US could shake it off by Easter. Remember that? The difference between that and Cuomo's March 8th fear itself briefing, I guess, was that Cuomo actually believed, even if wrongly, that the virus could be contained by quarantining and contact tracing. Trump appeared to be selling disinformation to encourage economic activity to help himself get reelected. So for the media, instead of just spending more time on how to actually contain the virus, we had to point out that the Easter recovery projection was mathematically impossible and the opposite of what was actually happening with COVID cases. Then on April 23rd, 11 days after Easter, hearing that disinfecting with bleach killed COVID on hard surfaces, Trump suggested the possibility of injecting bleach into our bodies. 2 days later, on April 25th, hearing that UV rays from sunlight tended to weaken the virus, Trump suggested that maybe shining UV rays inside people's bodies on their internal organs would make the virus go away. And the media had to spend days worth of news cycles publicly cringing at those things so people didn't, damage themselves by actually shining those cancer-causing rays on their innards or killing themselves more swiftly by ingesting bleach. And as we know, the battle between COVID information and COVID disinformation continues to this day. These days, of course, mostly about vaccines. And in that realm, there are so many examples from people or groups with various beliefs or interests. One example is, we just did a segment on the show yesterday with Washington Post reporter Garrett DeVink, who wrote an article called "How Wellness Influencers Are Fueling the Anti-Vaccine Movement." How wellness influencers are fueling the anti-vaccine movement. And part of that was about how it's not just people in the right-wing QAnon type world spreading disinformation about vaccines. It's also people in the wellness business, more associated with the alternative left, right? Like if they're selling supplements or many other things considered natural, they might try to make money off vaccine disinformation as opposed to their alternatives, or just argue that their belief systems, if it's coming from a belief system, arguing for those belief systems by spreading false information about vaccines. And not for nothing, that reporter's beat is defined as technology and misinformation. And I'm sure that beat was only created in very recent years. By the way, this to me is the tragedy of Andrew Cuomo. He did actually build his brand in 2020, mostly by trying to be real about COVID while Trump was being fake. And in fact, lots of governors did, both Democrat and Republican. Cuomo was just especially good at communicating on television at a time when New York had so many cases, and they were picked up nationally quite frequently. That's why he won an Emmy for those daily briefings, though it's now been rescinded. And the tragedy is that even while acting in good faith, I think for the most part, with very difficult decisions about how to manage the pandemic, he nevertheless tried to cover up some of his mistakes, like where 12,000 COVID patients died. As most of you know, that question about whether they died in nursing homes versus other facilities, it was one of the first moves of Governor Hochul when she took office to reconfigure that official number. And apparently Cuomo had done that for financial gain from his book deal or political gain. And you know, that then, well, he then allegedly bullied people who challenged him on that. And then that was the last straw for people with sexual and other workplace harassment grievances to come out of hiding and go public with their cases. And so in a way, that's the tragedy of Andrew Cuomo. But Cuomo's a sideshow. The fact that bad information spreads quickly and widely on the internet is the main event. One distinction I'd like to make, there's a difference in the way I use it, at least, between disinformation and misinformation. We hear both words used a lot these days. Misinformation is the spreading of things that are wrong, but people don't necessarily realize they're wrong. They're just badly informed a lot of the time. Disinformation is when you spread a falsehood on purpose. So remember that as an example of disinformation, in the 2016 election campaign, some things like that were spread by Trump supporters to help turn people against Hillary Clinton, like that she was running a child sex ring out of the basement of a DC pizza place. Remember that one? That's a QAnon one. And that disinformation had consequences. In 2017, a 29-year-old man was convicted of firing a gun into that pizza parlor based on that fake news. Other people made up fake news in the campaign because it made them money. For some reason, the country of Macedonia, as some of you may remember, had become a hotspot for people, often teenagers who were social media savvy, to make a buck or make a dinar, which is what I think they have in Macedonia, by making up bad stuff about Clinton and charging companies for advertising, which they could do when that fake news story went viral. Media reports at the time said these kids were by and large not political, but they found that fake news about Hillary Clinton went viral if it was well written. Fake news about Donald Trump, for whatever reason, did not. That was actually the first context of that term, fake news, really coming into prominence in the modern political discourse. And this is really the deeper point that I'm making here about the media in 2021 that would probably make the late Dick Salant's eyes pop out if he came back and saw what was happening. Dick Salant, as president of CBS News, some of you know this background because of New Canaan, he created 60 Minutes. He supervised Walter Cronkite as they expanded the nightly news from 15 minutes to 30 minutes way back when. And he established the credibility of CBS News as the central part of his legacy and as the news division's main selling point. Now, Dick Salant, as Anthony said a little while ago, died in 1993. If you think about it, that was just before the internet as we know it really took off. In 1995, Craigslist, eBay, Amazon, and Match.com all went online, 1995. A decade later, in 2005, New Yorker magazine writer James Surowiecki wrote a book called The Wisdom of Crowds, which posited that large groups of regular people, often communicating online, would come together and make better decisions about things than small groups of elites from their fields. Now, this was an enticing proposition at first and built on the idea that the internet was going to democratize news and information, right? Dick Salant was in the credibility business at a time when the technology of his day was defined by scarcity. Think about it if you haven't thought about this before. The scarcity of who could afford to own a television station or network. If suddenly after World War II, TV was the dominant news medium, well, how many people could own a TV station, right? Even fewer than could own a newspaper. It was in 1960 that A.J. Liebling wrote in the New Yorker, "Freedom of the press is guaranteed only to those who own one. Freedom of the press is guaranteed only to those who own one." A famous quote in the journalism world. And he was referring to owning a printing press. Freedom of the press, if you own one, a printing press. TV stations were that much more expensive to own. So scarcity was the context for the old credibility. The new credibility, the wisdom of the crowd, was supposed to be that lots of people acting out of personal experiences that were diverse or self-interest would make more well-rounded and trustworthy news and information and opinion than Salant and Cronkite because of whatever blind spots people like Salant and Cronkite might have had in their elite bubbles, however well-intentioned. So in this new environment, remember all those original big websites were created in 1995. So it's around a decade later. Facebook was launched in 2004, YouTube in 2005, Twitter in 2006, and the wisdom of the crowd era was really on. Internet optimists hoped that a more people-driven rather than corporation-driven set of truths would become the norm, and even that publicly developed truths would simply be truer than the old truths, and there would be a wiser wisdom from the wisdom of crowds. And you know what? In some ways, these things have happened. If you think about it, all kinds of voices who were marginalized in the past have more of a public say today because of the low bar of entry to social media and the fact that they have the chance of whatever they post catching on and becoming widely discussed. But few people predicted the extent of misinformation and disinformation and how much they would come to compete with professionally sourced news delivered in good faith, and for that matter, how much they would drown out a more earnest version of crowdsourced news, not to mention, trolling and doxing and other forms of being as mean from below as, say, Andrew Cuomo ever was from above. And so here we are. I don't know if there's a mathematical equation for what happens when viral disinformation meets an actual viral virus. but someone might try to measure that. Ivermectin, anyone? So thank you for listening to these random thoughts. Now I think Nancy is going to ask me some questions. And then again, you can too by using the chat function on your Zoom screens.
Oh, thank you, Brian. Everybody should chime in as they want to, but I will get this conversation started. One thing, I'm going back to what you said about Kellyanne Conway to start, and it made me wonder, do you ever wonder how many minds you change, where you see your job as trying to put out the truth to combat misinformation, disinformation? Do you think you change people's minds?
Well, I think it's a lofty goal to try to change people's minds en masse. You know, one little public radio show in New York, primarily broadcasting locally. So I think all we can do is make a good faith effort to put out the truth, to put out a lot of clarifications of things. And, you know, then you hope that it catches on and that there's enough of that going on from other people, that there's a critical mass of factual information that it, you know, not changes people's minds like this show is about what I think, not what you think, and I'm out to change your mind, but just kind of clarification of facts and contexts that hopefully are perceived as in good faith, and then people can make up their own mind in the context of reality.
And how do you keep your own politics out of the discussion? How you're known for being so respectful and so balanced, and how do you kind of keep your own opinions at bay?
Well, I would say it's not entirely about keeping my own opinions at bay. I certainly keep them at bay a lot of the time. You know, I see my main role as interviewer and facilitator of information and of dialogue and interaction. There, you know, are times in the context of what I was talking about, you know, in my remarks, where more frequently I'll just have to say to a caller than let's say 10, 15 years ago, you know, that's just wrong, that's just false. There's no evidence that there were millions of fraudulent ballots cast on election day last year or anything like that. You know, so those come up as sort of opinions, but then, I mean, those aren't even opinions. Those are just statement of facts that might come out in the current context more like opinions, because everything is so polarized. But because I see part of my job as trying to depolarize, sometimes I'll express an opinion, but I see it very differently than when most commercial media talk hosts express their opinions. I just quoted a minute ago, without sourcing it, a famous Rush Limbaugh line, a thing that he used to say, you know, when he was alive and working. And it was sort of a joke. It was sort of tongue in cheek when he would say it on his show. It was, "This program isn't about what you think, it's about what I think." You know, and he would get a laugh from his followers and fans on that. But also, that is more of the formula for commercial talk. You know, a host with a strong opinion, and then people either listen because they agree and they love them, or people hate listen. People definitely hate listen to those kinds of hosts sometimes. But so sometimes when I give my opinion, I'll do it as an act of disclosure rather than, I hope, rather than an act of hubris or I know better than you. And so transparency also builds trust. That's a reason to give opinions sometimes. But then hopefully my relationship to my opinion is one that's such that it starts a conversation rather than stops one by having everything that comes after it just be you're right or you're wrong.
Well, so that leads me to think about something that's happened recently in the news with Fox News, where Fox News came out with a policy that all of its employees had to be vaccinated or else test daily, which is more stringent than the CDC recommendations. And yet several of their main hosts have been pushing the anti-vax narrative. And what you're talking about, I was wondering if you could comment on that, because what you just said about disclosure seems to me crucial to that decision by Fox and versus its commentators.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess there's a conflict there between what they consider good corporate policy, that is the vax or test requirement, and what they consider good ratings, and to give them some credit, freedom of speech. So if they have some hosts who disagree with company policy, and those hosts are able to say it without fear, I mean, on one level, that's a good thing. But does it also point out hypocrisy that they're giving maybe the biggest platform in the country in the prime of prime time to people who are trying to downplay the vaccine, while they kind of know, wink, wink, that the responsible thing to do to protect their own employees is to have those rules. So it's sort of both of those things, I guess.
You were talking about ratings. So I would like you to comment, if you can, on why you think there remains so much coverage of Donald Trump, even though he's no longer president.
Well, some of it, I think, is ratings, maybe for the other guys on cable, CNN and MSNBC primarily. I think they experienced, after the inauguration of Joe Biden, ratings somewhat falling off a cliff, because Donald Trump, even if people thought he was bad for the country, knew that he was very good for television ratings for obvious reasons. People couldn't look away and felt so strongly one way or another. In fact, I think it was the president of CBS or the president of CBS News, so maybe it was somebody who actually held the same title as Dick Salant at some point. I forget exactly which title at CBS, in the CBS executive suite. In 2016, when Trump was first running for president, said Donald Trump may be bad for America, but he's great for CBS. It was something along those lines, and that was why. So my guess is that for those cable channels, and maybe for some other media, I haven't made a study of this, but this is just how it appears to me, trying to hold on to the Trump story and then the January 6th story as much as possible, stoked and fed the anger of some of the core viewers, and that would keep the ratings higher than they might have been if they just kind of forgot Trump and went on to all the issues surrounding whatever Biden did. There may, however, to give them some credit about not just being about ratings, there may have been a point of true belief there too at those networks that what had just happened, especially the way it ended with the insurrection, was so important to follow closely and really take a deep accounting of in the weeks and months that followed, that they felt there was an intersection there between what might get them viewers and what they might do, while some other news networks or news media were maybe, in their view, too quickly going on to the events that followed.
Okay. I see some questions popping in, and one of them was something that I had wanted to ask you about, so I'll dovetail into that. Is how do you set priorities? How do you pick your guests? How does your team operate? I think people would love a little inside look at how the Brian Lehrer Show operates.
Sure. Let's see, where should I start with that? Well, I'll start with our basic sort of clock in the 2 hours of the show. There's no rule about this, but this is how it comes out a lot of days. We usually do 4 segments a day. That can vary too. but most typically 4 segments a day. And in the first hour, we'll tend to do things that have strong news hooks within the news cycle of the last day or so. So if people are already familiar with something that's new and have heard the headline, let's say, and want to hear people's opinions about that story, or want to hear a deeper analysis of that story, those are the things we're looking to satisfy in the first hour. And usually it's one national segment and one local segment along those lines. And then in the 11 o'clock to 11:30, half hour roughly, it might be a deeper dive that's a little more off the headlines, that's maybe a little bit, that could be a book interview, for example, or the article I was talking about before, how the wellness movement is helping to spread vaccine disinformation. I mean, that wasn't hooked to something that had happened that day. That was a deeper look at that by that Washington Post reporter. So he was on in that slot. And then usually the final segment is a caller with no guest. So we will look for a question that will draw interesting responses from the listeners that could be hooked to the news, frequently hooked to the news. I think after that, let's see, what did we do after that wellness segment yesterday? I think it was how did day one of the vaccine mandate to dine in New York City go for you if you work at or own an establishment? And so just letting people call in, and we try to design those call-ins so that they bring in very different kinds of calls and very different kinds of listeners on different days. So one that comes to mind is after the earthquake in Haiti, and we had just done another one fairly recently before that, after the assassination of the president in Haiti. We just invited Haitian Americans or people with ties to Haiti to call in and explain it from your vantage point to everybody else. So we're looking for ways to bring in a lot of people who might not call talk radio generally. The old way of doing it, I think, is you'll just throw out a controversial question. Should abortion be legal or should abortion be illegal? And then, people are going, yes, yes, no, no. And often you get the same callers who have an opinion about everything, who wanted to be on every day and that kind of thing. So we're always looking for these questions that have some first person. Do you own a bar or restaurant, or a gym or a music venue? And day one of this went into effect. Tell us, your personal story. Help us. I often say in the caller pitch, help us report this story. I don't just say call in and give us your opinion. Help us report this story. So with all kinds of different groups of people. So that's the on-air part. And then the off-air clock is I have a team of 5 producers, and call time, well, let's say right after the show, around 12:30, we meet and discuss the next day's show and also some longer term projects, and then people go about booking, and then usually I prep 2 of the 4 segments, and producers prep the other 2, and send them to me by around 9 o'clock in the morning, so I have some time to edit before the 10 o'clock show. And and in the 12:30 meeting, we're always looking at that clock. We want to balance national coverage and local coverage, more local than national, but we know our audience is interested in both, and there's no sort of commensurate national talk show really in New York, so we're trying to serve that function as well as national issues matter to a local audience, obviously. And looking to represent the interests of diverse communities. And so a story that people in New Canaan are interested in, may not be, because it affects you personally, might not be by and large some of the things that I will probably ask Mayor de Blasio about tomorrow, like the staffing shortage at Rikers Island and the consequences of that, which by the way include COVID spreading faster there than in the general population right now. So those are some of the things that go into both the design of the show, within the show, and as we're planning the show.
And someone's actually just asked if you're going to continue with the Friday morning with the mayor, with the next mayor.
Yeah, well, we have to see who's elected, and then we certainly will invite that person.
Have you ever had a caller you don't like?
A caller?
Yeah, like someone you were just desperate to get off.
Oh, I'm sure, of course, but I'm trying to think of, I'd love to tell you a story rather than just say yes, and none is popping to mind. I mean, we have callers who spread disinformation, to go back to the theme of my talk. We even sort of, in a way, explicitly invited it the other day. Well, I'll give you a little context even for that. One of the tensions that we deal with in terms of trying to put out accurate information is when there is some disinformation out there, do we deal with it explicitly to correct it and try to serve a purpose that way? Or are we better off ignoring it, because if we give it a platform, it risks developing even more of a following than it has just by the exposure. Somebody made up a line, I wish I knew the source of this, but somebody once said, a lie runs around the world 3 times before the truth can get its shoes on, or something like that. And so we fear that when we do corrective segments about disinformation. Are we risking the side of, we know we're risking, but are we more likely to incur the side effect of amplifying it than the effect of correcting it? However, this week, for example, we had a guest, a COVID expert, on specifically to answer COVID, to debunk COVID myths, and to take calls specifically from people who have not gotten vaccinated. Now, not everybody who's unvaccinated is spreading disinformation. Obviously, there are a lot of people who are just uncertain for a myriad of reasons. But we figured we were going to get at least some anti-vaxxers who were going to call up and just say things that weren't true. And sure enough, one guy called up and he said, more people have died from this vaccine than all the vaccines combined for other things in history. And I guess, the expert knew that did not hold up, or even the fact that the framing was kind of fraudulent because there isn't a lot of history of people dying from vaccines. But that makes it sound like a big risk. So we knew we were inviting some callers who we wouldn't like, to get to the actual question that you asked. So that's an example of that. And, I just try to deal with people respectfully, because usually smacking people down doesn't help convince anybody of anything or clarify anything. It just sends people to their corners. But we did have one last week, for example, in this realm, who called up and said, as somebody who, against the that rule we were talking about regarding entering restaurants and things in New York, that you had to be vaccinated. He said he's starting to feel like the Jews in Nazi Germany or Black people in the United States during Jim Crow, that there are places that they were being discriminated against for their status, and so he was identifying as somebody who was choosing not to get vaccinated as somebody who was somehow being treated the equivalent of Jews in Nazi Germany or Blacks in Jim Crow America, and I just had to say, that's offensive. And then we answered the science question. But sometimes you just have to call people out because it's just offensive.
Do you think that this is now where we are? Do you think we'll ever get to a place where there is a fact and not an alternate fact, or not disinformation?
It's a good question as to what direction we're going to go. I think ultimately more people will believe facts than alternative facts, because ultimately there's proof about so many things that should not be sources of debate, and things that can be sources of debate, like how best to deal with problems, should really have platforms for robust debate. But in terms of facts, it's going to be a process because of social media more than before. And it's something that society will have to manage. And I don't know exactly how it's going to go. If the politics, one nightmare scenario, and people have started to talk about this with respect to, for example, the Georgia voting law that got passed recently, and some other states are looking at similar things. Not even so much about making it harder for people to vote, but about what happens after the votes are counted. The way Trump is trying to overturn the election, this new Georgia law gives the state legislature apparently more power than it had previously to overturn what the elected Secretary of State determines to be the true outcome. So if that goes from professionalized based on the facts to politicized, and people are willing to run over the facts of even an election to put their party in power, if in the presidency, let's say, just because they have the majority in the legislature in a given state. And theoretically, it starts happening on one side of the aisle, it could start happening on the other side of the aisle. So that's a nightmare scenario that would be devastating to democracy. Hopefully it won't get to that. And there will just be enough people who care that facts are facts and see the consequences of fakery as worse than the consequences of their side not being granted power in given instances.
Let's hope. Let's hope. I'm going to take some questions from your very large audience here. Tell us about one or two of your most memorable interviews that might have impacted events at the time.
Let's see, impacted events at the time. Well, one, frankly, I think that I want to give credit to other branches of the news and information business for this. Usually what has an impact is not so much the conversation about things that happens on a talk show like mine, but the investigative journalism that takes place in news outlets. Certainly WNYC has that and has made an impact with all kinds of investigative reports. And then we might talk about them, but it comes from the digging, it comes from the investigation. And of course, you could all probably think of many examples from different kinds of media. I mean, you could go back to the classic Woodward and Bernstein continuing to dig into Watergate when people were dismissing it at first as a 2-bit break-in. And then all kinds of things at the local level, state level, national level, so many things. So to be fair and to be candid, I don't think we have a lot of impact on the show in that respect. I'm thinking of a time last year during the height of the summer protests last year, and there was some police violence against a crowd in the Bronx that has resulted, in official findings of misconduct. But at the time, when Mayor de Blasio came on, he was trying to downplay it and say it was a very difficult situation, and the cops were up against what they thought was going to be a riot, and we went back and forth on, well, there wasn't a riot. There was just what the cops thought was going to be a riot, and then they committed acts of violence, some of them. And that got a lot of pickup and a lot of play in other media. Maybe that's one little example, but primarily, all praise to actual investigative journalists, which is an area, investigative journalism is an area that's, struggling to keep its funding up, and especially in the local news context, because there isn't the economy that there used to be for local news for some of the reasons we were talking about earlier, and how it's possible to make money or not make money on local news. So one of the things that my station is doing right now that I'm very proud of is investing new resources into investigative desks and massive local coverage, trying to become a news organization of record when a lot of the commercial news organizations, not just in broadcast, but also many of the newspapers, neighborhood newspapers, citywide newspapers, don't have the economy anymore. The business model isn't supporting anymore having a robust staff of actual reporters. And it's ironic that because people care about public radio, our listener supported model is actually maintaining and sustaining actual local daily and investigative reporting more than a lot of what might have seemed like bigger news outlets in the past. So all praise to investigative journalism, and let their business model exist.
Ben Vilas has asked, has the teaching of journalism in universities changed since the growth of social media and the internet? Is the concept of balanced news, getting opinions from multiple viewpoints, still considered a good idea?
I would say it is. I don't teach presently, and I haven't been in journalism classes, but some of my colleagues in the WNYC newsroom teach as adjuncts, and just knowing them and knowing a few faculty members, I guess, in one or two J schools and what their orientation tends to be, I would say yes. I think that journalism schools tend to be pretty good in my experience. I guess the closest contact I have with them is that we have interns all the time, every semester, a new crop of interns from J schools. And my sense of it is that they are getting a pretty well-rounded picture of the importance of professional news and the opportunities and perils of social, like I was talking about earlier.
Here's a question from Richard Porter. He's wondering about who your audience is. He says, you seem to have a fair number of very conservative, even Trumper listeners to your program. Any estimate of the percentage and your thoughts on that audience?
No, I don't have. It's one thing that Arbitron does not do. They don't measure people by political affiliation. And I am happy to have, I'm sure in this area, I would say that, my impression from our calls is that our audience fairly closely represents the region. And, in the tri-state region, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, were predominantly blue region, but not zero. Trump still got something like 28%, maybe it was, maybe around a quarter of the vote, even in New York City, and a little more in the suburbs. So good that we're attracting a politically diverse audience. That's definitely a good thing, in my opinion.
Kenneth Burb has a quote here from Gary Kasparov saying, "The point of disinformation is not just to get people to accept a lie, it is to annihilate the truth and exhaust people's defense of the truth." And he was wondering what you thought about this and whether you'd comment on that.
I would say to Gary Kasparov, check and checkmate. He nailed it perfectly. Yeah, and I guess to elaborate on what I think he might have meant by that, it's not just to get an individual lie believed, but it's to foster so much distrust in the idea that there can be truth or shared truths, or even just truth, that it then makes it easier for despots to take over. Because if nothing is true, if there's no truth, or if there's no shared truth, then there's only your interests, truths, and your opponents or other people's interests, truths. And that is a condition under which democracy can fail and despots can rise.
Sapna Shah asks, how confident are you that media companies and news programs will make a concerted effort to tackle mis or disinformation, even if it's going to impact ratings?
I think that that's always a tension when money is in play. And I think we're seeing that tension play out, in ways that we've been describing and talking about this whole hour. And I guess I guess you sort of asked me a version of that question before, Nancy, and so I'll come back to where I was. I'm more optimistic than pessimistic that in a society like ours, the truth will out eventually, but it's not guaranteed.
This actually comes from Haley Fuller, who is a journalism student. How do you think students in the next generation of journalists can combat misinformation and best serve the audiences of the future?
How can journalists in the next generation combat misinformation? I think by being really good communicators about what's true. I think formats matter. I think that is clarity of communication styles matters. There are ways to build trust in the way you deal with people and in the way you package information. And so I think that the next generations of journalists need to be very aware of how people are getting their information. So obviously, if we're talking about now things that spread on Facebook or wherever that are false, people need to be really familiar with how Facebook works and be able to use that medium as well as a newspaper or a radio station or a television station, and then just build their own credibility by being trustworthy people.
Do you think that Facebook is responsible for the content that it posts?
It started out as a really difficult question. I want to respect the tension involved in the two sides of that question, because when Facebook launched, and probably Twitter and other platforms, they didn't see themselves as political. They saw themselves as new ways for people to connect with each other. Remember in the early days of Facebook, we were talking about families connecting. We were talking about groups of friends developing. There were and are very positive uses. People in isolated communities, for whatever reason, in rural communities, who got connection to the quote unquote outside world. People in marginalized communities, people in communities of disability. Social media has been very good for LGBT people in certain respects. When mainstream media that was top-down driven, wasn't there for equality in the same ways that maybe they've more or less come to today. And so a platform is just a platform. It's another way of communicating. At first, yes, but then once there's such consequences of disinformation, then it starts to become the responsibility of the platform operators to do something. And again, to give them a little bit of respect, it's hard to find that line between freedom of speech and being treetops against disinformation. But I guess we've come to the point where they really need to do it. And because it's not intuitively in their interest to do it, we've come to the point where government may need to force them if public opinion doesn't.
Okay, I also wanted to ask you, because actually there's so many books coming out now that the library is going to have a whole shelf about this, but the Sean Spicer and Stephanie Grisham and people that were certainly involved in putting forth disinformation, misinformation, now writing books, sort of the tell-all books in some ways to exonerate themselves. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on, in my view, people that have played both sides. When it was to their benefit to do one thing, they did it, and now they're cashing in it and making a lot of money on a book to sort of as an expose.
Yeah, and it can be, and I haven't read either of those books that you mentioned, so I really can't express an opinion on how earnest they are. It is possible for somebody to be involved with something and then, come around to having second thoughts about what they were involved with. But I think, maybe it's just for money in their cases. I mean, I'm more concerned, they were both press secretaries. Stephanie Grisham, for people who don't know, Nancy online, she was Melania's press secretary, and Sean Spicer for Trump. But so for them in the PR business, maybe it is just all about spin and making a buck now if they're dishing in a negative way on Trump or people in his world. It's more threatening to me in the political realm. So like Kevin McCarthy, the GOP leader in the House, on January 6th, he was basically out there saying, Mr. President, you're responsible for this. And then when he realized that so much of the Republican base around the country supported, if not the insurrection, the basis of it, the big lie, then, he made a famous kiss the ring visit to Mar-a-Lago after Trump was out of office, and has come around to strongly defend those in his caucus who are pretty outlandish on that stuff, because he's trying to maintain power. And so the tension is there, I think, not just as a matter of personal political power, staying in office in his district, but trying to maintain or attain a majority for his party by getting behind a big lie that he once denounced because it's popular. To me, that's much more scary than these books.
Okay, just a couple more questions. We could talk all night. I don't know, Anthony's gonna have to chime in and tell us when to end this, but somebody who's anonymous has asked, who is your hero?
It's, you know, hero, it's so fluid. You know, like when I was 9 years old, my heroes were baseball players. And maybe when I was in college, you know, my heroes were musicians. And as I became a journalist, my heroes started to be people like Martin Luther King and Gandhi. And then in the COVID era, my heroes became essential workers. And so for me, you know, I'm kind of on a downwardly mobile trajectory of who my heroes are, I guess.
Okay, Anthony's telling me two more questions here. So Debbie Smith asks, you're so well informed. Can you tell us which your go-to news sources are? And if you still read newspapers, which ones do you read?
Well, I don't get any print subscriptions anymore. I haven't picked up a print edition of a newspaper, certainly since before COVID. But even before that, I mean, there was a time doing the show where I had what I guess I would call the four of the New York dailies delivered to my door. And by the time I left for work, around 6 in the morning, there was a New York Times, a Wall Street Journal, a Daily News, and a New York Post, you know, in front of my door. And I would skim through them on the subway on the way down. You know, I have about a 40-minute subway ride in normal times. And so it hasn't been that for a while. And, you know, certainly I will read I will look at the Times every single day. And because we cover New Jersey a lot, NJ.com, which is the Star Ledger site. And then I read a lot of news aggregation things in the morning. You know, there are a lot of sites now that aggregate the Politico New York does it for New York. I think there are similar ones for New Jersey and Connecticut and probably most states, where they're aggregating what they see as the most important stories in the actual newspapers or reporting by TV stations or whatever. So I'm looking at those. It may surprise you to know that sometimes my first news source of the day is Twitter, because it will, well, for one thing, I follow a lot of journalists and news organizations, so I will tend to see a critical mass of what's out there on a given day, but also I'll tend to see what stories people have started reacting to and talking about. So I know this is not a simple answer to what seemed like a simple question, but as the online era has progressed, it's become an increasing challenge to just keep up with the news on a given day in a way that I think I'm responsible to do, because there are so many sources. And, you know, WNYC itself puts out a morning brief that in print lists the stories that we're covering that day and that our local news website, Gothamist, is covering that day. So I'll certainly look at that every day, and some of these other things, and these aggregators, and Twitter, kind of a people's aggregator, to see what's out there. And with so many news organizations, so many individual commentators who matter, it's really difficult to see everything that needs to be seen. So I go through aggregators a lot, and hopefully it leads me to you know, it does. I mean, it does every day. It leads me to a lot of things that I wouldn't just go to if they were my go-to sources, which can get you in a rut and can get you in a bad habit, you know? So maybe I'll see something. Oh, I do subscribe to some liberal and conservative, explicitly liberal and conservative sites. So I can see what major opinion pieces are being written from various points of view, and of course, others that are not ideological in those ways. But you know, if you're following the thread on something that you see on an aggregated site or on Twitter, you know, maybe it's going to lead me to a newspaper from Arkansas that's reporting on the COVID outbreak there and what's going on in the hospitals there that's not happening here that I might not naturally run into. So that's my complicated answer to a simple question.
All right, last one. There's a lot of comments about how wonderful it is to actually see you. Everyone knows your voice. So Robin Sherwood says, have you ever thought about going on TV?
Well, I've done a lot of TV actually. I had for I guess about a dozen years, I was doing a weekly TV show that you could only see in New York City. It was on the local cable channel that CUNY TV, City University, does. And it was so I've done local talk. I appear from time to time on different stations as a commentator when they, you know, want me on for some analysis or commentary. Mostly these days, New York One, which you can only get on Spectrum Cable in the 5 boroughs. But you'll run into me from time to time on some of the networks. I did a bunch of MSNBC guest spots actually during the impeachment and the 2020 campaign.
Well, Brian, I think I speak on behalf of everybody. It's so odd that we can't clap and thank you in person, but thank you for your time. Thank you for your insights. And we hope that you keep doing what you're doing for many, many years to come.
And Nancy, thank you for incredibly smart questions. I can tell that you're a lawyer and used to work as an assistant district attorney in Massachusetts because your questions in your set were so well focused. And to the very smart people who would turn out even virtually to a library, also great questions, folks. So thank you for turning out, and maybe another time in person again, I hope.
And on behalf of New Canaan Library, thank you, Brian. Thank you, Nancy, and thank you, New Canaan community, for joining us this evening. Have a wonderful night all, and stay well.